How's it going?
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me once again for Trad Queen Story Hour. Tonight's interview is with the inestimable Matt Palumbo. He is a content creator over at the Bongino Report, and he also wrote a book whose title I can't recall. I'm sorry, I had it pulled up. Matt, you want to tell us about your book real quick?
Fact-checking the fact-checkers, and I'm forgetting my subtitle in the moment.
Yeah,
But
the
we're both
subtitles always get me.
Yeah.
But it's all about how the left co-opted the fact-checking machine and made it into their own. So, Matt, I'm really excited to talk about that. How are you? What have you been excited about lately?
Oh, very good. Sorry, the subtitle is How the Left Weaponized the Fact-Checking Industry.
Yes.
I don't know how I had a brain fart on that. So what was the other question? What's exciting me recently?
Yeah, what are you up to lately? What are you excited
I
about?
guess the book coming out somewhat exciting. It was a lot of work over, it was probably a 4-year-long project, but the real work was maybe 3 or 4 months. Like, it was just sort of a process of bookmarking every fact check I would see that would infuriate me for many, many months. And then I just sat down for 4 months straight and went through, a pile of hundreds of pages of things I printed out over the years and just went through everything one by one. And then I had a team of friends who were sending me even more. And once I finally had a final manuscript, every single day there was still a new thing I had to debunk. So I eventually just had to say, come to terms with the fact that I can't disprove everyone. And, ended up being, I think it's probably close to like 400 pages. It'll probably end up being, which is a lot of fact checkers. But, the point of the book is they are a Trojan horse for censorship. And it is, we'll get into many other avenues they're using hate speech we were talking about before the show, but so-called disinformation is the big one. And I know I'm not saying anything anyone doesn't know, but yes, anything contrary to the regime will get classified as disinformation or censorship. And, there's countless examples I have a chapter in the book, just COVID era specific examples, that was a big one where, listen, it is true that scientific evidence changes here and there, more evidence comes in, but knowing that you can't authoritatively make any declarations about anything. And then once the science changes, they never really, as I just said a second ago, I get that you adjust to new evidence, but whenever there would be a huge flip-flop on masks or why the vaccines aren't as effective as we thought, or 1,000 other regulations, there was never an explanation of, oh, here's why. Like, whenever, there were certain COVID restrictions put on or removed, there really wasn't any thresholds hit or there was just never an explanation. It was all arbitrary. And, even people making internet memes could almost seem more competent than scientists. Like, when they would point out things like, we all saw in New York City where you couldn't eat indoors, but you could eat inside a tent that was outdoors. So you could eat indoors, outdoors, but not indoors. Like, just little things like that where your average person could figure out it was absurd. And I almost said as like a thought experiment, I'm like, find some guy on Twitter 3 years ago with a screen name like, Patriot Man 420, and compare his predictions about COVID and the cultural impact and the economic consequences to the 100 top scientists in the world. And Patriot Eagle Man 420 has a better track record than these experts. So that was just one particular example where we have an entire scientific establishment. We have the fact checkers backing them up, and they got pretty much everything wrong. And here's the thing, too. I would have gotten everything wrong as well, but I'm not a PhD in science, and I don't have any influence over people's lives. Right. So that's just one section of the book, but then the rest is just sort of different categories of incompetence. I have one that's just, fact checkers trying to do economics, and here's how that and one of the things that's, my background's econ, and one of the things that was useful, and even though I never really used my degree, is it was very easy to tell when people are using words they don't understand. In fact, I won't say who, but I've written arguments for people like on TV, like scripted certain things for them because they knew I was allegedly an expert on certain things, and I could tell when they were presenting it they didn't understand like the premises and why it led to the conclusion I said. But it was with PolitiFact, I could totally tell they had no idea what they were saying. Like, they quote an expert and then their sentence trying to explain what the expert said would be totally wrong. Or they wouldn't know how to measure the national debt. Like, the way economists do it is you measure it relative to the size of the economy. and it just gives you a more of a idea of how manageable it is. So like there was one where they were comparing the national debt under Trump to, you know, prior presidents, and they didn't even know like to adjust for inflation when comparing among like comparing a president in the 70s to today and not doing any sort of adjustment for inflation or measuring to the size of the economy. And really, I could probably just go on for 3 hours of little examples like this, but that's the whole book. I try to keep most of my rebuttals to like a page to 2 pages, so it's just here's what they said. Get a load of this guy. Here's why it's BS. On to the next one. And I made the table of contents like 15 pages long, just so you could get every single thing is spelled out. Each thing I refute line by line, and I made it so you don't even have to read it sequentially. You can just kind of see what's interesting to me today and just see why they're morons.
That sounds amazing. That sounds like a handbook for understanding how the media is like actively undercutting all of our confidence in all of our institutions. Like, yeah.
I was going to say too, like they do sort of work in tandem with the media. There was one thing I caught PolitiFact doing during the presidential debates in 2016, where they would target the Republicans that were most likely to win the primary. So when it was down to Trump and Cruz, they were fact checking Trump and Cruz. Like before it was obvious Trump would win, they were fact checking them really aggressively, more than anyone else would fact check, and they were doing it equally. Once Trump pulls ahead and it's clear he's going to win, it was as if Ted Cruz no longer existed. All the fact checks went to Trump. And it was because they wanted to portray him as just this, you know, unique liar who is so much worse than anyone we've ever seen. The Washington Post sort of had this infamous list of 20,000 Trump lies. And I didn't go through the whole thing. I just did a sample, or someone else did, I think, that I quoted, of a couple hundred of these. And they would inflate the totals where if Trump had a rally and he said something that was slightly off, and then he had 5 more rallies in the week, that would get counted as 6 lies. So they would take a claim, and every single time it got repeated would get added to the list. And then there were even things in there that were like clearly inside jokes or hyperbole. There was one where it was during the government shutdown, one of them, where there was this infamous photo, not infamous, it was iconic, I should say, photo of Trump serving McDonald's to all these athletes.
Right.
And you probably remember it. He's in front of it like this. But he made some comment like, you know, there's so much burgers here. If you stack them, they'd reach a mile high.
Oh, I remember that.
Yeah, I'm not kidding. Someone at the Washington Post sat down and did the math to see if Trump ordered enough McDonald's to reach a mile
Actually,
high.
That's not true.
It turns out it wouldn't. So, yeah, but stuff like that. So, like, I don't think Trump intended that to be a literal remark, but just little nitpicky things like that. And I don't want to be too all over the place. So I'll let you
That's great. No,
yeah,
that sounds like fun. You kind of got the fun side of holding the media accountable for what they do. So I'm really glad you did that. I wanted to ask you 2 questions. First of all, have you considered making a curriculum for people who read the news to figure out what the media is doing? Because I pointed out to my viewers, they often will leave things out. They just won't cover them at all. Sometimes they will give you a misleading fact in an article that they go back and stealth correct, that no one ever sees the correction. They'll correct it either at the end of the article, 3 days later, or they'll correct it in a second tweet that no one sees. Just things like that. Do you think that would be useful for the ordinary news consumer, people who don't have a lot of time on their hands?
Yeah, and I mean, I try to do that to a little extent with this book and just showing how the fact checkers do it. But there's sort of a whole within reporters, and these are tangential to the fact checkers. They call themselves disinformation reporters, and their job title is almost literal because the biggest disinformation reporters spread the most disinformation. I mean, the job title is supposed to be they're anti-disinformation, but if you look at like Ben Collins, Brenny Zardonsky, I'm probably mispronouncing her name, but they are the most prolific ones. And it is interesting. You could I think Twitter would actually probably be the best platform to kind of show how the sausage is made, in that you see it in real time. And everything you just said, you can prove in every single case without exception. So, I mean, I wish an example came to mind, because there is a phenomenon you mentioned where it is stage 1, total lie. 100,000 people retweeted, and then the follow-up is the LOL JK, and 30 people will see it, and they keep up the first tweet because as they correct themselves, it's almost like a insurance. It's going, okay, I'll make it look like I'm a real journalist and I correct myself, but they keep up the first tweet because they know most people aren't even going to see the correction.
Right.
And yeah, it's all in the framing. I mean, one of the ways the fact checkers make it seem that Republicans are more dishonest is they just selectively fact check Republicans more than Democrats.
Yes.
I mean, I remember someone emailed PolitiFact asking why they would never fact check Vice President Harris during the 2020 race, and they said something like she's not an important enough figure or something, and yet they had fact checked Mike Pence like every other week, in the weeks before that. So it's just all completely arbitrary. Another example of PolitiFact that comes to mind is they played a huge role in promoting Obama's claim, if you like your healthcare plan, you can keep it.
Gosh. Yes.
And in fact, they did, I think it was 8 separate fact checks where they would debunk Republicans claiming, no, actually, you won't be able to keep your healthcare plan. And their whole case rested on Obama says so. And hey, we found 2 experts who we can email and agree with us, which you can find 2 experts who think the Earth is flat. But this is relevant because I think it was in I can't remember the exact, I think 2012 or 13, where every year PolitiFact does this Lie of the Year segment. And they picked for the Lie of the Year Obama's claim that if you keep your health care plan, you can keep it. If you want to keep it, you can keep it, because it was undeniable at that point that you couldn't. But I highlighted that earlier in my book because I'm like, they were going to bat for Obama for years on this claim. And if they themselves had to rate something that they defended adamantly as the biggest lie of the year, the most blatant lie ever told that year, how can you trust them in anything? And the thing I love the most is in their takedown of this Obama claim, which they ripped as unrealistic and never had a chance of becoming true, they never once mentioned they defended it on their own website. 8 times, at least, that I could find. So it's just everything is completely made up as they go. I'm trying to think of another usual example, and I hope I'm not rambling too much. But
no, you're good. Go ahead.
Okay, all right, good. This is sort of the media narrative creation. This was middle of last year. So the way economists define a recession is when there's 2 negative quarters of economic growth. So 6 months in a row, the economy contracts, gets smaller.
Right.
So in the first quarter of 2022, the economy shrunk. So right before the numbers for the second quarter of 2022 were going to be reported, everyone was pretty certain they're going to be negative. So when that happens, the headlines are going to be second quarter of negative growth, a recession under Biden. So the White House did not want that to happen. So they assembled the fact checkers, and they had to convince the fact checkers to put out this narrative that actually is not the definition of a recession.
Yeah.
Now, the reason they did that is because Facebook, and formerly Twitter at the time, they had partnerships with these fact checkers. So if any media group reported it as a recession, they would get a warning on their post saying, no, this was fact check, it's not true. And it forces everyone to hedge their own reporting, because if you get hit with a fact check, and anyone who manages a social media page knows this, but they ding your reach. So your posts don't show up on people's pages anymore for months at a time, but they punish you. So it forces you to report in a certain way. And what I found that was amazing, and the way I tackled this claim is, because it was this ambiguous part where they are technically right. There's no actual formal definition of a recession. It's just that at no point in the past 70 years has this one ever been called into question. So it's like, what are you doing here? And what I did was, for every fact checker I found disputing this, I was able to find a case where they themselves in the past used the 2 quarters definition.
Wow.
So Louis Jacobson at PolitiFact writes this huge 1,000-word article trying to cast doubt on this definition. So I just found an article, I think 2016 or so, where he was fact checking Donald Trump, because Donald Trump said in Obama's last year in office there was a recession, and this same guy said, no, it's not true, there wasn't 2 negative quarters of growth.
There you go.
So, and I found every single journalist, every fact checker trying to spin this. I don't know how this was the case. Every single one of them used the correct definition years prior.
Right.
So it was almost like a joke that God wrote, where he was like, no, I'm going to make it really easy. This time, 100% of them will contradict themselves.
Yes.
That was probably the most egregious one I found. And I think there were even cases I found where, like, the White House will alter transcripts, and one of them was in regards to this, but there have been other cases where the White House will correct a Biden gaffe. They will rewrite history,
right?
And then fact checkers will write their fact check of the Biden gaffe based on the White House's transcript.
Wow.
So it'll be like Biden saying something stupid, and then this sort of, I did a chapter called Fact Checkers versus Our Own Eyes and Ears. And it's 100% cases where there is a video of Biden screwing up, and the fact checker's going, no, actually, believe us.
Yeah.
And it's as if they're targeting liberals who don't watch the video themselves. They just hear there's a controversy about it and then read the rebuttal without watching it. I can't, it's just so unconvincing to anyone who's seen it. I don't get how anyone could believe it.
Yeah, well, that doesn't surprise me at all, because the people that I ran into during Trump's tenure were the people I met who had changed their minds about Donald Trump had done so because of, instead of just listening to reports about a Trump speech, they actually took the time to sit down and watch it and hear it with their own eyes and ears. They totally changed their views on him because they realized that the media was lying to them. And I wished, obviously, that more people had done that. But it sounds like that's exactly what you're showing, is that that's the case, that they go in and they retrofit reality to make it go in the direction of their own rhetoric, which is fascinating. That's definitely something I noticed. So it sounds like there's a process to this. It sounds like they get their marching orders, right? Here's what we need to say. And then they put it out to the fact checkers. The fact checkers put it out to, for example, PolitiFact or NewsGuard or whatever. And then they go through and they restrict people's reach in conjunction with algorithms, which sounds to me like the perfect ideological capture between the media and big tech. So on that note, what did you think about the Twitter leaks? Did everything make a lot more sense once you learned about the cooperation between the government and places like Twitter and other social media sites?
It's one of those things where it's not at all shocking or surprising. It's just one of those things where we all know it's happening, but it's almost seems like something out of a movie, so it's just hard to picture. Then it's right there. Oh, of course, yeah. What did I expect? Yeah, it's I mean, first of all, I guess thank God that Elon Musk ended up buying Twitter. And it's funny. I predicted in my book, I finished it right as the acquisition was happening. That community notes would kind of be redeeming for the fact checking industry, and that there is evidence that, or it sort of plays out of wisdom of the crowds, that this phenomenon that if you get like a mass of people to guess on something, their answer is usually right. Like if you take 1,000 people and you show them an elephant and say, guess the weight of the elephant, for some reason, I have no idea how this happens. If you average up together their answers, you almost get the exact right answer. So I was kind of speculating, like maybe there's going to be a fact checker version of that where it's not going to be perfect, but hey, there's evidence that Wikipedia on non-political topics is actually more accurate than Encyclopedia Britannica, because there's always one guy who can correct something. And it's not true with political topics. There's a lot of gatekeeping there, but it is true with the non-ones. And I thought with community notes, we're going to have that version for fact checkers. And it seems to mostly be working well. It happens to liberals. It happens to Republicans. Elon Musk gets fact checked on his own website. But we're even now seeing PolitiFact getting fact checked. Because a lot of the biggest lockdown proponents are now trying to rewrite history. It is now undeniable that they were wrong. Mm-hmm. And Fauci, Randy Weingarten, all these people are trying to downplay the past. And the way they're doing it is highlighting their statements, but not their actions. So Randy Weingarten will say something like, I think the way I put it is they're like, Randy Weingarten is taking hostages, and because she's willing to negotiate, they're claiming she wanted schools open. Like Randy Weingarten's argument was the equivalent of saying like, yeah, I favor opening schools if you give me $1 trillion and a mansion and a Rolls Royce. And the fact checkers look at the opening schools comment and go, well, obviously she wants them open. I'm being extremely hyperbolic here, but that's literally the logic they're employing. She made these completely insane demands for schools that would cost hundreds of billions of dollars that no one could ever actually expect they would get. And then because there was contingency, she would at least open schools. They claimed she wanted to open schools, but herself acted against that until at least 2022.
She's a particularly egregious case, and I really enjoyed watching her get that context added. Most recently, the one that I was highlighting because I tweeted and I tagged community notes was President Biden saying, this is what happens when you invest in America. We have more work to do, but this is real progress. And he shows this graph of job creation, and Trump's obviously is negative because of COVID. And then his is just through the roof because all of those people immediately went back to work. He shows himself as being higher than Reagan, as being higher than H.W. Clinton and W. Bush. Absolutely nuts. So he did get the fact check, but one thing I noticed, I don't know if you've noticed this too, but it comes and goes. sometimes you'll see the fact check and sometimes you won't.
I think you can upvote and like vote them useful. I
Right.
think the amount of votes affects that somehow,
Okay.
but I'm not
Okay.
sure. Yeah, that might
Yeah, I
be
think
it.
you might be right. I always vote these things helpful. I vote
Me
them
too.
helpful almost anywhere I see them because, I don't care if you're fact checking a right winger or a left winger. I want the full context. If someone's showing me a picture from like 2012 with Jordan Neely,
That actually is the most useful part of it. Is these little like chain email era type pieces of misinformation
right,
where it's just like someone will present like a movie clip as real life. I've seen happen, and people are like, "No, this is from a 2008 film starring Tom Cruise. It's not such
right.
and such." But I've seen things like that even happen.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's wild. And this
Yeah.
I've seen journalists lose their minds over this because I'm
Yeah.
like it must for them feel like they're losing their grasp on this big tech giant that they used to have. How do you think they're going to respond to that over time?
Yeah, there's a quote from Thomas Sowell. I think it's about affirmative action, but it applies here that if you're used to special treatment or being a privileged class, then when you're finally treated equally, it seems like discrimination. But
Yeah.
it is what we've been going through for years, and that's what I remember when my book went up for pre-order, or someone tweeted at me making fun of me. This guy got fact checked a bunch of times. And got so triggered he wrote a book. And I read it. And I'm like, yes, that's exactly what happened.
Yeah,
It was
exactly.
every single day for years, and
Right.
it got to the point where like I would, and I was totally bluffing, but I would always threaten to sue them when I would write emails to them explaining why they were wrong, and I'm like, get this off my page or something's going to happen.
Right.
They would 90% of the time they would remove them. Facebook would say no, we got it wrong, or whatever condition, or okay, because they would target us over anything. We could
Yeah.
even one thing the fact checkers do too is this sort of tangential fact check where like I think Bongino was talking on his show about there's a clip from like Pfizer in 2018 where they're talking about how they could build a pill with tracking technology. And Dan, when he was presenting it, said, he goes, my point here, and this is from 2018, this is before COVID, my point is this technology exists. A lot of people have been saying this is a new COVID related thing. It's not. My point is that this technology can exist and could be in a future thing.
Right.
Now, because some people misrepresented that clip, they still fact check Dan's video and put a flag on it and throttle his page because it's as if I don't know if they don't watch it or if they just do a general scan, but they will look for any excuse, even if you explicitly say, no, I know this has been fact checked. I'm not making this claim. I'm making a separate claim from the same video. They will still go after it. So I guess what will the left's response be? So far, it seems to be a lot of crying and whining. Like
Yes.
Mehdi Hassan made some really
Yes.
he made a statistical blunder where so people are when they talk about black and black crime, it's like 95% of African Americans are killed by African Americans. For whites, it's I think 80% of whites are killed by white people. But the percentage is not the what you do to compare those numbers. It's a per capita rate. So for instance, among white people, for every 100,000, about 2 are killed by other white people. For African Americans, it's about 20 out of 100,000. So even if the percentage was equal, it was 90% there, 90% there. It's irrelevant. I mean, Japan is one of the safest countries in the world. 100% of people there are killed by Japanese people.
Right.
If 100% of African Americans were killed by African Americans, does that mean their communities are as safe as Japan? Well, no. Or as dangerous? Well, no. The percentage is of a different number, so it's irrelevant. It's measuring, percentage of a pear versus percentage of a watermelon. It's just
Right.
you can't compare those two numbers. And Mehdi Hassan didn't understand this and got fact checking on community notes, and then doubled down with the same argument because he doesn't understand math. But it's very amusing to watch.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I am surely enjoying it, and I honestly love. You mentioned that Elon Musk got fact checked, but I
Yeah.
truly love when our dear leaders get fact checked
Mhm.
so hard too. I feel like this is 100% necessary, and I think this is exactly what Elon Musk was talking about when he said this is necessary to preserve our current way of government,
Mhm.
because unless you're holding people accountable, nothing positive is going to happen because these people run wild, exactly like we're seeing with our modern government. Now, the other thing I wanted to touch on, because your boss is Dan Bongino, and this is something I mentioned before the show, there was a time, and I kick myself for it now, I listened to Dan and I was like, wow, it seems like he's way out over his skis. I know he worked with some of these 3-letter agencies, but what he's saying just sounds off the wall. Now, of course, I'm like, oh my gosh, he was right about everything.
You mean the
Yesterday we were talking
Spygate
about
stuff, I assume you mean, right?
right. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So yesterday we were talking about how the DHS put together this training where a pro life middle aged woman is considered like one of the enemies. And I was just like, this is nuts. And this
Yep.
is something they've been doing for years. So Dan was right.
Mhm.
So I just don't know what to say about that. It's
Yeah.
getting crazier than even I thought it would.
Well, that writing Spygate with Dan definitely opened my mind to the kind of politics I do now. Like I was prior to that more of just a really boring policy guy who didn't like care about like I never knew anything about campaigning or even just like not as much about the workings of the government as I should or the sort of like House of Cards type of politics, which is totally real by the way. So yeah, it definitely opened my eyes to that, and it's really anyone contrary to the regime. It's not even like a right wing, left wing thing. It's anyone the state sees as an enemy. And there are, crazy, black socialist groups like Black Hammer that they're designating as Russian front groups with really
Wow.
limited evidence. And there are obviously countless right wing equivalents that they're doing the same to. But it's anyone that's really seen as a threat to the status quo or the so called swamp, whatever you want to brand them.
Yeah, and that's a big problem. And this is actually something that was rolled into effect shortly after September 11th, which should surprise no one because lots of people were pointing out that the Patriot Act was going to be a really good way for them to get their foot in the door and accuse all of us of terrorism. And they had people on the right even defending the idea that no, it's just going to be actual terrorists, but people who were looking down the road were seeing how this could be used negatively, and now we see it in its full glory. It's so great.
Yeah, the consequence of any government policy is it has to be analyzed through the lens of what is the almost like what would a dictator do with this kind of authority? Like as if what is the maximum possible thing this policy will allow for, and that is inevitably going to be happen because there's going to be someone who wants it to that extent. So that's
Yeah.
it. And we're seeing now the Restrict Act is kind of the latest iteration where Congress is pretending they're finally going to deal with TikTok in a way that only benefits them.
Right, exactly. And we're looking at the TikTok thing and we're saying, well, we want the government to be able to, for example, watch everything we do online and go in and monitor who we're connecting with and what we're saying and whether we can even connect to the internet in some instances. And this is something that people really overlook, but it's not working as well as it did the first time because TikTok isn't on the same level as an actual terrorist attack on American soil. So I have to say, I wish them the best with that. I don't know if it's going to go anywhere, but I do know it has bipartisan support,
which is a
pretty
sign
much
of disaster.
Yep.
Yeah.
Well, the fact that it has bipartisan support tells me pretty much everything I need to know about both sides of the aisle. Right? They're both out to get us. There's no escaping that. And I think
whenever most of politics is just for show, but the bipartisan is just the openly screwing us part.
Right.
Whenever people in the news say they want bipartisanship, I'm like, who are you people?
Yeah,
like,
why?
You know what I want is less of the things I want. Like, what are you talking about?
Yeah. Well, people complain about gridlock, and I'm like, no, I want them to do less. Yes, do nothing.
That's the thing. Like, even as much as Obama sucked, the deficit went down after his first year or two in office because the Republicans didn't let him do anything. And then, he loves to take credit for it, but it was Republicans saying, no, we're not going to pass a budget, so it only went up baseline, and that ended up helping. But,
right.
Yeah, gridlock's pretty good.
Yeah, it's way preferable to people on both sides of the aisle agreeing that they need to take more power. That's just a serious problem. Yeah. Where do you see this ending as far as like a peaceful solution and ultimately peace between people in the U.S.? Do you see any positive solution in that regard?
Honestly, I don't really know what the right answer is. I guess the lazy answer from me was I wish everyone would just read the exact media I read, but that's probably not a viable answer to the problem. I often have the national divorce fantasies, but then when I have the thought of like, well, obviously that would result in a conflict, and what percentage of people would I be comfortable with losing their lives for this? And it's zero, so it's not really an option there. I really don't know. I'm almost like a sort of self-balkanization where we're still united union, but red states are really red, blue states are really blue, and we just have, federalism, really. It's just, hey, the government's for the military, for some regulating some interstate commerce, and that's really it.
Yep.
That would probably be ideal.
Yep, that's been my conclusion as well, because everyone's been talking about civil war, and I'm just like,
Yeah.
first of all, that is not what you want. And I
I
know
really,
you
I
might
don't,
be
I really don't want to get shot at, to be
right,
honest. I
exactly.
really don't at
Well,
all.
there's a specific part of the right wing that's like, we have all the guns, we're
Yeah.
loaded up with testosterone and energy and we can take it on. I'm like, no, it's not going to go the way you think it's going to
Right.
go, period.
Yeah.
And then there's the consideration of like another country stepping in and taking over this. And if you do choose to dissolve like the federal government, you're going to run into problems with immigration, which admittedly we are already seeing. So I don't even know if that's a valid argument anymore. But I think that that's definitely something to keep in mind. I see you've been tweeting about what's looming at the border for Thursday. What are your thoughts on that? Do you have any positive thoughts for us
Oh
on
my
that
God, it's
regard?
gonna be a total disaster. The crazy thing about the whole situation is too, is under COVID, Trump got all these emergency powers, and it proved that we could have secured the border at any point in the past century. It was like, oh yeah, all we do is lock it down and say no one can go through. Okay, there's no more illegal crossings.
Right.
So uh it's a weird spot for the Biden administration because they're doing this balancing act where it's like they actually do want more illegal immigration because they want it. I mean, the real end goal, and I know every Republican knows this, is you have a critical mass of illegals, so we get to the point of what are we going to do with them? Okay, we legalize them, but trust me, it's the last time we're going to ever do this, even though we just did it in 1987. But it's really the last time for real. They're all going to vote Democrat, and so on and so forth. And Biden wants that, but there's also the optics of the border, so they have to sort of also pretend they're doing stuff. So like they're sending troops to the border, but they're not actually going to deport anyone.
Right.
And it's a weird balancing act of optics to also trying to undermine the country. And for a while they were keeping these Trump ones in place, but I guess now the jig is finally up. But no, it's going to see. I mean, I think the average levels of illegal immigration are like 4 or 5 times higher than under Trump pre-COVID, and it's only up from here. So no, it's going to be horrible. And I guess will be amusing seeing them bust to blue cities who all of a sudden can no longer handle them. But besides that, no, it's going to be horrible for the country.
It has been really interesting to watch the mayors of these cities tap dancing around holding the federal government responsible for this. Of
Yeah.
course, the responsibility must 100% go to Greg Abbott and Ron DeSantis for doing this horrible thing to them. I think it was New York City recently that was complaining about 1,300 migrants. Like they don't know 10,000 come across into El Paso every single day, or they just don't care because it's not really their issue, but they are sanctuary cities and they need to live up to their name if this is how it's going to be.
Yeah, like if you're someone who's non-political and you're told, "Hey, we have these illegals and you have to pick where to send them," and you're told, "Hey, so we have cities that in response to Trump made laws saying we accept these people, we want them, you are welcome here, come here," and we have some cities saying we don't want these people, you'd go, "Okay, well, I'll send them to the first group. It seems like they're on board here." And then we
Right.
say, "Okay, great," we give it to them, and then they say, "Whoa, all right, Hitler, what are we doing here?
Right.
What do you want from us? Like, you just told us you want these people." And like at Martha's Vineyard, it was like 50 people was too much for them to handle. And then they patted themselves on the back when they found them a new like it's just insanity. And it just shows how performative our politics are, and that the whole open borders thing is largely a reaction to Trump. In that, and you can, this sounds almost made up given politics the past 5 years, but I saw polling in Pew that like 90% of Democrats were for reducing illegal immigration up until 2015. So
Yep.
it's just weird. The human brain is that breakable that all that has to happen is the host of The Apprentice has to say, yeah, this seems like a big problem. And all of a sudden, half the country goes, oh, I guess it's great that 1 in 10 people in this country we can't keep track of.
Yeah, so
Weird.
that's really interesting, and I feel like more than anything that should show us exactly the mindset that people have. Like people are so capable of switching back and forth between two different viewpoints. It's seamless. There is absolutely zero concern that there is conflict between these solutions. How
Yeah.
is it possible that people hold two views at the same time?
I mean, a lot of it, you see it on Twitter, it's sort of like a good psychological experiment. A lot of it is just to fit in. It's so much easier to just like go along with a trend. And
Yeah.
I'll even find myself, like, I'll read like an opinion 10 times in a row where I'm like, that's kind
Oh,
of, I
yeah.
don't think that's the correct conclusion, but I just, do I go, all right, I can respond to this and explain why they're wrong. and read 30 messages telling me I'm an asshole and they're unfollowing me, or I can just get back to work and go to the gym. So I'm going to do that. It's a very minor version of it. Like I would never take a position I don't believe, but there are times where I'm just like, oh, what's the point in arguing with people on the internet today? So I'll just not comment. But I think there are some people who are much more active than me who just go, all right, well, I guess I'll go with my tribe on this one.
Right.
And
Right.
there it happens naturally. Like with politics, there are so many issues that whenever there's a new one, it's so much easier just to default to who you trust and mimic and sort of just mirror their opinion. And I think conservatives are generally right, so I think that on average you'll actually come to the correct opinion doing that. But people do sort of do that a bit too much, I think, and yeah, it shows up.
Yeah, it's certainly dangerous to outsource your thinking to anyone else, even somebody you like.
Mhm.
Like there's no reason to assume that you owe some person loyalty for
Right.
whatever reason, especially a politician.
Mhm.
Honestly, you don't owe any politician loyalty. They need to serve you. That's why they call them public servants. Theoretically, they are supposed to work in the interest of the people, which means that ultimately they're accountable to you. You're not accountable to them. You don't owe them your vote or anything like that. But so you guys, Dan used to work with Fox. What did
Mhm.
you guys think of Tucker leaving in such a fuss?
So Dan's, it was just a routine contract dispute. I mean, I don't have the exact details, but it
Right.
was exactly as he told the audience. There was nothing nefarious or anything. And he's a very busy man, obviously, even without the Fox show. Tucker seems like there's definitely something going on more there. I mean, he was Rupert Murdoch was meeting with Zelensky like 2 weeks before Tucker's firing. Tucker is obviously one of the only major networks that kind of goes against the grain on the Ukraine issue, and I mean, isn't even anti-Ukraine, just points out, hey, we're spending billions of dollars. It'd certainly be nice to know where the money's going. And with our foreign policy, every 20 years, we look back and go, wow, with hindsight, it was really dumb decisions we made on arming the Mujahideen slash,
Yep.
intervening in Afghanistan, this Iraq slash whatever. And then we do it again every 20 years we do again what we did 20 years before, and if you question it, you're against the country or you're anti such and such. And I'm going, you guys were alive back then. Like, how do you not? I mean, I was okay. It's in fifth grade when we made, but how do you not remember that?
Right.
Anyway, but my point with Tucker is he would also go against the grain on the pharmaceutical companies, or he would attack investment firms that would even themselves advertise or themselves be part owners of Fox. And obviously that angered a lot of people, but it shows how I think important of a voice he is, and he's someone who an audience is going to follow. He is not there's so many just random daytime hosts on Fox, but really any major network where once they leave the network, like a year later, you're going to be like, oh yeah, that guy, I forgot. Yeah, what was his name again? Tucker is not one of those people. He has an
Right.
audience and they're going to follow, and I do think this is going to hurt Fox a lot in the
Right.
long run.
Right.
Yeah,
Right.
unfortunately. And listen, I say that as someone who goes on Fox all the time. I want what's best for the network, and I think it was a bad call.
Yeah, possibly. Definitely so. Well, I think given that their ratings have been crashing after he left, well, the other thing that I'm noticing is that the left wing is very quick to assume that his audience will do nothing but follow him because they're a bunch of rubes who'll believe everything he says. I also think that's the wrong tack to take, but it is true that when he left Fox, a lot of the viewers from Fox immediately went right over to Newsmax, which was very interesting. Like, they had done the homework and they're like, all right, so if I don't have Fox anymore, where am I going to go? I have an alternative. I think that's great. I think that's a really positive thing. What do you think Tucker's going to do next?
So it's tough because what I've read online, and I treat everything with a pound of salt. Basically, was that he's still in contract. So
Yes.
if there's something nefarious where they're trying to censor him, it's in this weird. It's going to be this situation where they're paying him millions of dollars a month to not talk to keep him in contract. I mean, I don't know how these disputes work, but if he has an option to break the contract and obviously not get paid, I assume he'll just take that immediately. I don't think it's about the money for him at all. So it's either they're going to keep him censored for some greater purpose we don't really know of yet, but I had some examples that maybe could have been the reason why, or hopefully he is able to get out of the contract and start his own thing.
Yeah, for sure. Well, do you
Yeah.
see him doing something like Dan did where he went over and built his own thing? Because not only did Dan build his own show, he also created the parallel economy, which is a super, super cool alternative to stuff like Stripe and PayPal, or sorry, Patreon, and some of these other places that are super, super censorious. Like Patreon, I think it was, went after Sargon of Akkad for something that he said within context was in no way insulting on a different platform years back. And I was like,
Yeah.
that's nuts. We need another option. So do you
Yep.
think Tucker's going to do something awesome like that?
I would lean there just because, and I'm not in the guy's head, but I assume even if he got a generous offer, and I know he has from, I think, One American News and maybe Newsmax, I imagine he must still, even with like these more favorable networks, must have some concern over not having 100% editorial control that he
Right.
would have his own thing. So I just would lean towards the starting his own thing. And I've seen some sort of rumors of him, competing with Fox or something. But again, I don't really know what to believe at this point. But just
Yeah.
my guess.
Yeah, that's fair. I really hope he does do something like that because we so desperately need things like Dan brings to the market with literally a different payment processing system that's so cool and so valuable, and something that nobody, I think, had ever thought would be possible to do. When the leftists used to tell us to make our own Twitter, nobody actually thought that anyone could actually do anything like that, right? But
Yeah,
Dan proved it was possible.
it's very much needed because there are, for a while we've had this adage of go woke, go broke, and there are little countless. I mean, but the Bud Light example to some extent, and there's others we could look at of like companies doing some dumb liberal thing and alienating their audience. But
Right.
there are, unfortunately, I would say more examples where there are companies that are so big that you really can't boycott them. Like
Right.
if my electric company decides to do some tranny drag show thing, there's no competitor.
Right.
And there's just a lot of brands that are so major that, like, even with Anheuser-Busch, they own so many different breweries. There are people who are boycotting Bud Light who don't realize the beer they're buying could be an Anheuser-Busch one. I think most are, but I mean, there's going to be some percentage. So the reason we need the parallel economy is like we need go woke, go broke to be true. We need the alternatives for that statement to be true, and it's going to help with that. And yeah, even things like payment processors, like, we agree there's a right to discrimination when it's, the cake shop owner who has religious beliefs, because there is another cake shop within a 1 mile radius of his cake shop. There is, listen, if he was the last cake shop on the planet, I might have to say, okay, we might have to reevaluate this. But the point is he's not, and he's never going to be. So with a lot of these woke firms, well, we need to make sure there's 1,000 other cake shops people can go to.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. Well, I think that's something that people kind of overlook. People don't think often about payment processing. That's the way you become uncancelable, because when they go after you, they're going to go after your credit card and your bank and how people can give you money, because that's the quickest way to undermine your message, is to silence you by literally not even giving you a platform. You won't have the power to make sure that people can see you speak. So this is crucial. This is one of the underpinnings and stuff that it's not very glamorous, so nobody ever thinks about it. Do you think that the right is getting better at coming to terms with that?
I think, there's definitely an increasing awareness of how much everything is rigged against us. And, liberals like to pretend these culture wars are sort of like diversionary issues away from like other issues, but they're the ones who create them all. Like someone posted that it was the craziest cell phone I had seen the day. It was like, hey, we've had drag queens for decades or whatever. No one cared then. All of a sudden Republicans care. And I'm like, that's the point. We didn't care. No one cared. You're involving children, so we care. Like, that's what we're saying. We're saying we don't care until you don't have children, and then your rebuttal is, oh yeah, you used to not care. And I'm going, yes, that's what I'm saying. Like, that's the point. Anyway, my point is, I do think we need to fight these cultural issues, because that is how the left is winning. They're not, young kids are not, Generation Z are not liberals because they took an economics course and were wowed over by John Maynard Keynes's theories. It's because the only views they ever see represented in every single corporation, every single movie, every single TV show, by every single musician, by every single, really, people who put themselves on TV just in general seem to all espouse a dominant liberal view. And there is some phenomenon where once a view gets, I think it's maybe 70% support, the other 30% just shut up entirely. And in the media, it feels like there is 100% support behind these left-wing views. And there are a lot of people who just, when they see the same view espoused by a dozen different people that are powerful people, that are successful people, they just go, that's the view. That's the correct view. And that's how most people get their opinions, unfortunately.
Yeah. Well, the left would like us to think that children are very deep thinkers and philosophical ponderers. We know they're not. They tend to parrot back the views that they see in front of them all the time.
Yeah.
So, and this is one of the ways that China's actually got a foot in the door with TikTok. They are telling our kids things that undermine the way our country is supposed to work, which actually ends up being a really big problem because then those kids grow up to be Gen Z. I don't know. Have you seen, I don't know, you're in the business of fact checking. Maybe you've seen these guys. There are a couple Gen Z dudes.
I know who you're talking about. The guy who
Yes.
the guy who can't comb his hair.
The hair. The hair, the Gen Z
Had
hair.
the man comb.
Yeah, man. It's the perms. I can't handle it. This must have been how people felt about millennials back when I was in high school with the emo kids. Oh my gosh.
I remember them.
It's infuriating. Anyway, yeah, these guys are so clearly on the Democrats' payroll. And there were even news articles about how Joe Biden was going to hire a bunch of TikTok influencers. Dude, the left is playing the culture war correctly.
Yep.
And they are winning, and this is exactly why. Now, I saw a tweet from the Carrie Lake War Room. This isn't Carrie Lake, but Carrie Lake is a huge supporter of Trump's. And it feels like, well, it read exactly like they were saying, look, the culture war matters, but this isn't really the time. And I was just like, no, absolutely not.
Exactly time.
Yes, this is how we lose, right? This is how we lose young people. This is how we stop appealing to young people, is to just not pay attention to what they care about. Now, I talked to Greg Price the other day, and I said, what do you think we should do about TikTok? And he said, we need to engage with it. And I'm like, okay. Unfortunately, I think you're probably right, because that's not really my bag. Those young kids strike me as kind of, off the wall. They're crazy. They do young kid stuff. But if we want to actually make a positive difference down the road, we have to make this investment into our future. And that means, yes, learning Gen Z lingo and figuring out what they care about. And I think that the right has had a hard time with that historically, but it's time for that to stop if we actually want to make positive changes. So, do you agree with Carrie Lake's War Room that we need to drop this culture war stuff and focus on the economy? Because I was like, no.
Well, actually, no. I mean, the thing about Trump's presidency, it was one of the rare, I think one of the only cases in history where a president's approval rating did not track economic sentiment. It's usually the better the economy, the better the president's approval, the worse the economy, the worse. And yeah, there's 1,000 other issues, but that is the one that correlates the most. And Trump, everything was awesome, and the media narrative was, this is unbearable. And the reason they did that was they did not report on the economy at all. It was, hey, he's locking kids in cages that have somehow been here for the past decade, but he did it. Yeah, he put them in cages. Or they claimed that, yeah, he said these Charlottesville people were white supremacists. And even actually in the book, PolitiFact also got that one wrong.
I'm sure.
Yeah, they defended they defended the incorrect context of it. But that's all was under Trump. It was 100% social issues, and it's beyond things like gay rights and abortion, which are kind of the two main ones. Is all these just little subset issues on every conceivable thing were used to attack him. And if they had only reported on the economy, there is no line of attack. And the thing too about the culture war is, like, the slippery slope is not a fallacy. It is. No. We greatly miscalculated how slippery it was. In fact, it is covered in ice, and you are slipping right down it. Like, if you look at like hysterical predictions of like certain things the LGBT movement could lead to from like evangelical Christians in the 80s, in 1990, 2000, it's like, look at these nut jobs. And then 2 years ago, you're like, wow, how did they know? Yeah. Incredible. And I was one of those people where I was like, guys, come on, like, just relax. I remember when gay marriage got legalized, I was like, well, at least this is no longer an issue.
And
if you actually look at activism, there's more now with equal rights than there ever was before. And I'm like, there is the weird thing where leftists can make activism perpetuate itself indefinitely, so that you can take an organization that has a mission, and then once the mission is reached, you just rebrand as some general tolerance and respect kind of organization, and you, as long as there's one crime against you per year, you're good. You can exist infinitely. And they're very, very good at this. The narrative creation, I will commend them, is incredible.
Yeah, and for sure, the fact checking is part of that. So, Matt, would you say that your book is kind of like the curriculum for helping people figure out how the media does this? Because I've been thinking about that for a while. We really need that for the normal person who doesn't have as much time as we do to read the news. Figure out
Yeah, so
what they're doing.
I made the first third of the book, though, how it happens and why it matters, and just sort of little tips and their own little tips and tricks to mislead. Then the last 2/3 of the book is just rapid fire. Each section is a entirely new fact check of just here's everything they got wrong in all these different categories. But yeah, it should be. I mean, it's not laid out like an instructive guide, but I think a perceptive reader will notice certain patterns of misleading, like, hey, they use the mean to measure income under this president, but they use the median under this president. Where they use two different measurements? Why would that be? What if you use the same one? What would happen? Wow, the numbers are completely different. What's not a coincidence? Things like that, or they just hold different people to different standards. I mean, one of the first examples I have in the book is Ron Paul saying we had no income tax before the 16th Amendment or before 1913, and PolitiFact saying it was half true, I think, because there were other taxes that affected income, even though Ron Paul was clearly meant a direct income tax.
Obviously.
So anyway, a few years later, a Democrat says there was no income tax before 1913, and they said it was true. So Democrat makes the claim it's true, Republican makes it half true. And, that is the metaphor for the entire book of how they go through people.
Well, that does feel like the standard for how they measure this stuff. If a Democrat says it, then it is true. If the opposition says it, whether it's a Republican or a Libertarian or some other person, it is half true at best.
There are cases where their rating amounts to it's true, but who cares? So like, Ted Cruz was like, the tax code is such and such longer than the Bible. And the fact checker was like, while it is true, there's no reason to believe the Bible is the correct benchmark document to compare length. And I'm like, it's a frame of reference. Shut up. Like, what do you want from us?
Right. Well, that's the other thing I've noticed too, is that the editorialization that goes around a fact check is extremely important. And you'll see something that they mark true, and then they'll say, let us go on to add some context for you. This is why, like, it doesn't matter, or it was true now, but it wasn't true when whoever was talking about it. They'll just obfuscate it by adding a few extra words. And I'm like, that's really sneaky. I have to give them props for that, because it's actually pretty talented. Look, they know what they're doing, right? Like, they gave you enough material to write a book.
So there was different realms of, like, there's different types. So there are some fact checkers where I'm like, oh, okay, you're clearly trying to just deliberately mislead and you're very clever, but I got you. There are some where I'm like, oh, you're just really dumb. Like, you have no idea what you're doing. Because a lot of these places, they hire interns out of college, and it's like, all right, let's take a 20-year-old communications major, and you have to be an expert in history, economics, geography, and political science. Good luck.
Yeah, that's too much.
And it's like, if you have a degree, you can maybe do one of those things, but they force these kids to kind of be a jack of all trades. And it kind of is like what I said earlier. They'll quote experts, but it's clear they don't fully grasp what they're supposed to glean from the experts. So it's very embarrassing.
Yeah. Well, there is a phenomenon that we used to talk about all the time over on Timcast IRL, where we talk about how you'd be reading on one page about something that you're familiar with. Like, for you, it would be economics. You'd be like, that's nonsense. They're full of garbage, whatever. You turn the page and they're talking about foreign policy, and you're like, oh yeah, okay, they must be right about that. So it's like, no, these are the same people writing just about a topic that you don't understand. So you give them the benefit of the doubt. Why? Because they're published? Because they're the person who managed to get in there and write it first? That doesn't make sense. But that's a psychological thing that it's very difficult to overcome. So very hard to see how we overcome that. But it sounds like your book is a great way for people to get into the fact-checking mindset and see all the ways they've lied about it. So what do you think has been the biggest fact check that ended up being a complete lie over the last, like, since you started looking at it, like maybe during Trump's presidency?
I mean, I can almost go by year. I mean, in the last decade, it was the Obamacare lie of the year thing I mentioned earlier, where that was the biggest thing they were defending. It was a central campaign promise, and he didn't get it. Trump's first year in office, I think the whole idea that he called the Charlottesville people very nice people, or he said neo-Nazis were, and what the context was, it was supposed to be a free speech rally that morphed into something else. So Trump was referring to those initial people and saying, there's good people on both sides. There's people there who were there for free speech reasons. There are some people there who were protesting what they saw as neo-Nazis. There obviously nothing wrong with that. And in PolitiFact's write-up, they didn't even write it. Just, it was interesting. They sort of tried to hedge their credibility where they didn't write it as a normal fact check. It was like an explainer type article where it was like, some readers want to know what Trump really said. So here's the transcript. And when they provided the transcript, they bolded irrelevant sentences, but they didn't bold the part where Trump says, and I'm not talking about the neo-Nazis, I'm talking about such and such. So they just would bold like random parts of that had nothing to do with the context. And then years later, someone claims, another PolitiFact writer I can't remember what the context was, but references, Trump infamously described these neo-Nazis as fine people, links back to that original Political Fact piece. So the article was to just confuse readers, to not tell them what they were supposed to know from this.
Right.
So they got, that was the biggest lie of 2017. PolitiFact got that wrong too. I think under Biden, the one I mentioned earlier, but trying to redefine out of existence what a recession was just nonsense. I mean, there are, and I even found things I didn't even know was true. I didn't even know that there are foreign governments that actually use the 2 quarters definition as their official definition. So while there technically in America is no official one, that has been the widely used one for at least 50 to 70 years from where I found it used. Other countries use it. Foreign central banks use it. There's just no controversy here at all.
Well, I feel like you could easily say, well, this is the common understanding of a recession, right? So this is definitely something that we should consider. But of course, they don't want to do that. It's so clear to see they have such an obvious agenda to anyone who's willing to look. But some people don't have the time, don't have the know-how, or maybe just aren't that engaged with the news. You mentioned something that Tim used to call cytosis, where a citation would point to another citation, which would ultimately result in like this feedback loop of sources citing each other, right? And that's a really easy way to slip it past people's defenses.
There are certain news reports that you can read and you can almost tell where they cut and paste things from and then reworded. Like it's that, like there are, if you look at reporting on like, I don't know, certain things about like the Proud Boys, there are certain things they put in there, like they're whatever supremacist group known for whatever incident, and it's like, oh, weird. 37 other articles mention that exact paragraph. It's almost as if you guys just cut and paste each other's stuff.
Yep.
There are certain things where it's like almost as if there's a quota where they have to mention certain talking points in an article about certain people.
Yes.
And once you see it, it's impossible not to.
Yes. So. Well, hopefully your book will help people start to notice that. That's awesome. What is the title of your book again?
Now that we remember it.
Right.
Fact-checking the fact checkers, how the left weaponized or infiltrated and weaponized the fact-checking industry. And it's, the premise is, listen, fact-checking was great for Bigfoot sightings and chain emails.
Right.
When it's politically charged, we just can't trust these people. Their error rate is far too high for them to be arbiters of truth. And, if they want to present themselves as opinion writers, that is fine, but they cannot be trusted to have oversight on any social media platform.
Right. Well, I think that's a very fair analysis. Well, Matt, thank you so much for your time. I think we're coming up on a full hour here, so cool. I will let you go. You want to tell everyone where you're working and what you're up to? I know we've been talking about your book extensively, but just give people the personal rundown.
Twitter, Matt Palumbo 12, and then obviously, you should all be on BonginoReport.com 50 times a day and continuously pressing refresh.
Of course. I'm sure that everybody is. Actually, probably a lot of people are.
Probably right now, they're probably not watching because they're doing that.
Right. Yeah. Oh, great. Yeah. Great. Thanks, Matt. I appreciate that for sure.
No, I'm kidding. No, we should do it after this episode.
Yeah, do it after. No, I appreciate that. I appreciate everything Dan's done. Andy, my husband, helped install Parallel Economy over at timcast.com because they recognized over there how important it is to have an alternative to the typical payment processing system. It's kind of like Public Square for other products for sure, and it's a good way to make yourself uncancelable. So definitely investigate that as well if you do use any payment processing programs. Matt, thank you so much for your time. I truly appreciate it. I hope that everyone now will go out and check out your book or put it on pre-order. It's not out till July, right?
Yep, yeah, it's out July. I mean, sometimes they come out, a little bit ahead of schedule. Depending on, the kind of the printing situation. But July 18th is 95% when it'll come out.
Awesome. Okay, yeah. Cool. Yeah, I'm so glad that we are talking about this just in time for this. This is so important and so timely. Matt, I will let you go. Thank you for everything. And to everyone who tuned in, I will see you next time. Bye, guys. how's it going?